focus with Ejaz here. The third round of talks between Iran and the remaining parties to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action were wrapped up on 1st May. The attempt is to bring the United States and Iran back into full compliance with the deal. Negotiators, however, gave contrasting accounts of the tasks ahead. European diplomats from what is called E3, that's France, Britain, and Germany, said the talks had moved slowly. We have much work and little time left. Against that background, we would have hoped for more progress this week. We have yet to come to an understanding on the most critical points. Success is by no means guaranteed, but not impossible. Talks have been adjourned until May 7th. Officials have said they hope to reach a deal by 21st May. That's the date when an agreement between Tehran and the UN nuclear watchdog on continued monitoring of some Iranian nuclear activities is due to expire. Iran's delegation head, Deputy Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, reiterated that Tehran expects the United States to lift sanctions across a range of sectors, including oil, banks, and most individuals and institutions. There are differences, big ones in fact, but since there's also been progress, we will continue negotiations next week, Araghchi told Iranian media. We will negotiate until the two sides' positions come closer and our demands are met. Earlier, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said the talks were in an unclear place. We have seen willingness of all sides, including the Iranians, to talk seriously about sanctions relief restrictions and a pathway back into the JCPOA. Sullivan was speaking at an April 30th security event. The talks began last month in Vienna with the remaining parties to the deal. The United States does not have a representative at the table because it left the deal, but European diplomats are acting as intermediaries between the Iranian and U.S. delegations. To discuss this further, I'm joined by Dr. Neda Bolourchi, JD Middle East scholar and postdoctoral assistant professor at Rutgers, and Dr. Atefa Toghyani, visiting professor, University of Tehran. Let me begin with Dr. Bolourchi here. Dr. Bolourchi, so contrasting views cautiously, Jake Sullivan's statement and Araghchi's statement seem to indicate that perhaps there's been some movement, but the statements coming out of the E3 representatives are not particularly optimistic. Give me your sense of where do you think things stand?
Thank you for having me back on. I think things stand at sort of that precipice where both sides, the Iranians and the Americans, are getting closer, that it is getting a little closer to the wire, and neither side wants to make a commitment and shouldn't be commenting. And so that we can sort of see them broaching it, but they're very hesitant because this is that moment where sort of the finer details, the exact steps should be getting hashed out. And I think that's why you see Jake Sullivan saying that there is some vagueness. Araghchi is basically alluding to that. And so these are, if the last couple of weeks have been the build up to it, we are at that very sort of pivotal moment. And so what happens in the next week will be very important when the delegates come back from their respective capitals with sort of the guidelines of how to proceed in the next step.
Okay, so I'm sort of unclear about, if you will, what Jake Sullivan said about talks being in an unclear place. Is he talking about the glass being half empty or half full? What exactly do you think he means by unclear place?
Well, I think exactly that, right? In the sense that he can't really comment, and the extent to which, President Biden or is going to give certain green lights for the next step. They have to work out, you largely probably want to work game theory. You want to see what's possible. You need to also see different interactions from regional players. And so in that sense, they want to sort of see what else they can do. The Iranians have made demands. And so it is unclear, or at least Jake Sullivan has to say it's unclear at this moment where they're going, right? Largely that probably has to do with the visits that we saw Senator Coons take to the UAE, the Israeli delegation here in Washington, D.C. And so there is still, I guess, maybe some information gathering on the Biden administration's point to try to sell this largely, but also to see what they are what they're comfortable doing in next steps. And that's why Jake Sullivan may be saying things are a little unclear.
Right. So I'm going to cover the Israeli delegation in Washington, D.C., and of course the fact that President Biden met with the Mossad chief. But one other issue, which of course is outside the talks in Vienna, so there are other challenges like the sabotage, which is suspected to have been carried out by Israel, and that struck Iran's Natanz nuclear site. And of course, we know that Tehran retaliated by beginning to enrich a small amount of uranium up to 60% purity. Do you think that is something which Iran did more to sort of, acquire some kind of leverage at the talks and also to signal that this is not something that Tehran would accept? Or is it, so essentially what I'm saying is that is this something which is reversible once they go back to, the deal? And second point, which I think is important, we know that talks had remained stuck on the issue of sequence, with the U.S. wanting Iran to go back to the original deal and Iran wanting the sanctions to be lifted. Do you think that we are slowly moving to a point where it will be more about simultaneity rather than a sequence?
So to your first question, I do think that you can absolutely interpret Iran's actions as retaliatory. People want to or think of the words of Iran will respond to something like Natanz with physical hot action. They clearly have taken for the last several years what they have called more of a strategic position where they don't always engage in hot action. And it is, in fact, using the enrichment process and the nuclear negotiations themselves as a way to retaliate and gain leverage. So you should absolutely interpret the increase to 60% as the response to the Natanz attacks. And that the Israeli, given that Netanyahu has basically agreed to it, and former Prime Minister Almut has publicly tried to shame him about that, that the Israelis carried this out. That is the Iranian response. Whether there will be any future hot action, is unclear. And then to your second question about sort of the delegation, I do think that it should be seen as probably again, as we're in that pivotal moment, I think where both Bolourchi and Jake Sullivan are alluding to that, the delegation's arrival and discussion with President Biden is sort of not a last attempt, but a very serious attempt by the Israeli intelligence to try and convince the Biden administration to either include different provisions or to make this a much more difficult process, given that everything else has failed.
Okay. Well, my second question about the issue of sequence or simultaneity, I was actually going to come to the delegation question later. But let's park that. Let me pull in Dr. Atefa Toghyani into this discussion and ask her what she makes of Arakchi's statement. Because Arakchi is saying the differences, big ones in fact, but since there has also been progress, we will continue negotiations next week. So from the Iranian side, clearly something has already happened which makes the Iranian delegation to stay and to continue to talk. What could possibly that be, Dr. Toghyani?
It seems that the deal is so fragile, and the history showed that it is. Besides, there are many groups inside the United States, as my colleague said, Israeli lobby or Congress, who are sabotaging the deal. Besides, there are some groups inside Iran that are against the deal, and they believe that United States is not trustable anymore, and the U.S. may get out of the deal once more, as it did during Trump administration. Of course, Israel also is in favor of the deal and is sabotaging to make some reverse actions against the deal. It seems that of course, the conclusion of the deal is not very clear, and there are very gaps for discussion and among two groups. But it seems that the first step that was gathering together in Vienna and getting all the signatories to committee, it was a very important step. And while it is small, but it was significant. And I think that we can hope a brighter, in fact, future in the talks.
Okay, right. So we don't know the details, obviously. But would you agree with the assessment that if Arakchi says that we will continue negotiating next week, then the Iranian delegation does believe that there is something on the table that would be acceptable to the delegation and, of course, the government back in Tehran. Now, on the issue of the government back in Tehran, let me go back to Dr. Bolourchi. Dr. Bolourchi, we just had this controversial sort of 3-hour tape recording of an interview by the foreign minister, Zarif, and Zarif has since actually apologized to the family of Major General Qasem Soleimani. Also, it was leaked. And obviously, I actually did a program, and my panel thought that the tape was leaked, obviously by people who wanted to put an end to Jawad Zarif's political career and also hurt the prospects of President Hassan Rouhani in the upcoming election. So, give me your sense of how much of this is kind of going back to the real government in Tehran, namely the Supreme Leader and the IRGC. It seems to me that the negotiations that are happening in Vienna, Arakchi is constantly on a sort of communication channel with the hardliners in Tehran. Is that sense correct, or are we reading too much into the sort of parallel systems that work in Iran?
Well, no, I mean, that's generally how governments work, right? In the same sense that Jake Sullivan has to say things are unclear, it's because he needs to have a fuller understanding of what has happened through intelligence and defense. It's the same reason why CENTCOM Commander McKenzie, when asked about the nuclear negotiations, says that he defers to the State Department. So anytime you have a delegation, in this case, your question is about the foreign ministry. So in the same sense, the foreign ministry, Zarif and Arakchi, they also have to check and verify with the supreme leader in Tehran to make sure that they're on the path that he has wanted. Zarif himself, in that apology that you mentioned, basically says that Khamenei is the leader and that he, as the foreign minister, understands his position is to follow and take the advice of the leader. And so while they're not exact parallels, you can see that the government structures operate relatively in that sense, right? That there is a central executive who is designing and getting advice from his appointees.
No, I perfectly understand. Obviously, J1 or whether it's Anthony Blinken, they obviously will be getting some kind of, advice from back home, there's a two-way communication. But my specific reference to the Iranian delegation, or to Bolourchi, had to do with the peculiarity of the system in Iran, where you have the parliament and the president, and of course Javad Zarif as the foreign minister, but then you also have, as clearly told, frankly, by Javad Zarif's interview, he might have apologized for some of what he said, but that does not take away from the fact that Khamenei and the IRGC in some of the areas exercise far greater control and carte blanche and final decision making compared to the sort of the official formal government, so to speak.
In relation to the IRGC, I think what you're seeing is that it is specific to the now deceased General Soleimani. And so we're not necessarily seeing that there's quite the carte blanche that he had, right? You have clearly in that tape the frustration of Zarif about the extent and depth and breadth of Soleimani's power and his ability to make those requests. But what you do see, yes, the IRGC has significant power and control domestically inside of Iran. It does a lot of things outside. But when it comes to these specific negotiations, in the absence of someone like a Soleimani, more of this will be directed through the Khamenei's office. He is historically known as a bit of a micromanager, and that is why there have been sort of historically some complaints about him as a leader, is that he tends to, again, historically get particularly involved. And so in the absence of someone like Soleimani, that Khamenei particularly trusted and gave such great freedom to, more would be through Khamenei's official office and his involvement. So to answer that very specific question, I think in the absence of somebody with the particular history and traits of Soleimani, you're going to see more involvement from Khamenei's office, yes.
Okay. Let me pull in Dr. Atefa Toghyani. Dr. Atefa Toghyani, one of the things that the Trump administration was trying to do, and frankly, there are a number of Democrats also who basically agreed with him, and that had to do with the fact that while technically, purely within the confines, the legal confines of the JCPOA and the inspections, Iran was following that particular treaty in letter and spirit. Trump was insistent, and so were many Republicans and Democrats, that they also needed to check, A, the Iranian power projection and covert activities in the greater Middle East, and also the Iranian missile program. Now, I raised this issue because one of the things that Javad Zarif talked about had to do with the fact that the Iranian diplomacy at times was hostage to the covert activities in Syria and elsewhere that were conducted by people other than the foreign ministry, other than Javad Zarif, and perhaps also other than President Hassan Rouhani. So how far is that a problem?
I want to make it clear that Iran nuclear deal is clearly about Iran's nuclear deal. There is no talk of what you said, like, for example, Iran's behavior in the region, or, for example, missile, or all these things that Congress, or as you say, Republicans or Trump administration mentioned many times. The point of the Iran's nuclear deal was to limit the Iran's nuclear program in response to removing sanctions from Iran. There are, of course, many points that Iran and United States are having controversies on. U.S. complains about Iran's, for example, international behavior, Middle Eastern policies, and Iran complains about U.S. presence in the region or many other issues. In fact, any kind of interactable conflict has the same diversity of controversies. It is not limited to Iran and United States. Of course, just getting further than Iran nuclear deal means that they want to, in fact, making some barriers to get to negotiation table and getting to any conclusion, any possible conclusion. Of course, let's look at other deals in the history. Look at the way U.S. had dealt with the Soviet Union. United States had continuous negotiation with the Soviet Union to limit its ballistic missile, but they never talked about other issues. For example, the international behavior of Soviet Union or Jewish minority of Soviet Union. It was a threat to the U.S. on that time. The ballistic missile of Soviet Union was a threat. For Iran, it is the same issue. Nuclear sanctions are the heaviest sanctions that ever happened for a country in the history. Of course, it seems that Iran wants to get out of this situation, and it showed that getting into other issues rather than nuclear issue makes very serious barriers, of course psychological barriers, and of course the physical barriers on getting to any conclusion on the negotiation table.
Okay, just one clarification. This wasn't my assessment, or this wasn't my sort of, analysis. I was just referring to how the Trump administration was approaching this and how so many Republicans and Democrats were in favor of this approach. But thank you so much. That was Dr. Atefa Toghyani speaking with us. Let me go back to Dr. Bolourchi. Dr. Bolourchi, there's another aspect also. I'm not sure, and I would like to get your take on this. I'm not sure if it has a direct bearing on the talks themselves, but reports that have also been unofficially confirmed by the Saudi side and by also the Iraqis has to do with the back channel Saudi-Iran talks. Do you think there's some kind of connection or, direct connection or indirect connection between these talks, trying to find some kind of modus vivendi, and also what's happening in Vienna?
Absolutely. It's very clear that the Saudis have taken a new position with this new administration, and I think that is definitely coming from sort of the changing tide out of Washington. And in the same way that the UAE had previously done a war analysis and saw on the first day of a hot war with Iran, they were going to lose over $1 trillion in significant infrastructure damage. I think the Saudis have seen, particularly with the issue and war in Yemen, that the conflict probably does not suit them, that they are not likely to get the extent of support out of Washington with the new administration, and that at minimum it's time to have verbal conversations about how things might change. And to sort of hop onto your last question and how it can relate to the question you're asking me, the JCPOA was supposed to be the foundation, to build on for the future. So even if the United States focused, let's say historically with the Russians on their missiles and only on missiles, when we come to the Iran situation, and it is just about the nuclear program and to build security around the nuclear program, it should be seen as the foundation of a house, not its roof. What that means is that you build on it, that if the JCPOA works successfully for a number of years, right, this was the whole point, 5 years, 10 years, 12 years, in certain provisions, then you can start talking with Iran about other issues because you will have built the trust, you will have the foundation that comes with years of an agreement working. So then you can talk about other regional issues and build on the success of the past. When the JCPOA gets trashed, then you have destroyed the foundation and you can't move forward and talk about other issues. So the Saudis seeing, right, and hearing from the Biden administration that this desire to move forward and return to the JCPOA, there's clearly a change, at least in tone, right? We don't have the tangible movement yet, but there is clearly a change in tone. And that directly, I think, impacts the Saudis and their approach And so at least verbally, we're seeing some change, and that's important.
Okay, so let me argue it like this and get your perspective on the argument. Now, as far as the Greater Middle East power projection and tussle was concerned, Iranians have, by far, have been successful vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia. Mohammed bin Salman has lost in the White House that internal connection, i.e. Jared Kushner is no more there. And of course, the fact that the Yemen war is not particularly, the Biden administration is not particularly in favor of the Yemen war. Secondly, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi was something which weighed heavily. And the Biden administration's report has obviously talked about that. So the Saudis realized that they need to sort of try and work out a different framework here. And the Iranians realized that having achieved what they set out to do vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, they now need the sanctions relief in order to do other things and consolidate their gains in the Greater Middle East. Is that the argument? Is that an argument that you would agree with?
I think I would not necessarily make them as sort of a grand strategy of Iran, right? Iran needs sanctions relief because it has 80 million people who need to be fed and have jobs, and ultimately the Islamic Republic wants to stay in power. So and it doesn't want to. It is my belief that no government wants to constantly be putting down protests. No government wants to. It does not look good, and it shouldn't have to stay in power by constantly resorting to the monopoly of violence, which is what government is. And so, first and foremost, Iran wants sanctions relief because it believes it's just. That's the first thing, that there was an agreement, and it is the just and fair thing that it gets sanctions relief. Two, it needs sanctions relief for its population and to remain in power. As number three. Four, does that work in its larger sort of strategy of a forward defense, in the sense that if the Iranians are in Iraq, if they're in Syria, then it is protecting them and their borders. Does it work out that way? Absolutely. Does it mean that it gives more probably support to Hezbollah? Yes. But as we already saw from the Trump years, the Iranian military budget did not take a hit. It didn't take a significant hit. I think it actually, if I remember correctly, increased 4% one year. Iran generally is very, I think, imaginative and creative about how it goes about engaging its policy and enacting its policy. And so does it work that sanctions will help them in the larger regional conflicts? Yes. Is it its ultimate aim? Not necessarily. But is it a top aim? Yes, it is.
Right. If they are imaginative, then I assume that there's a bit of the grand strategy also, but this is a point on which perhaps we will discuss some other day. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Neda Bolourchi speaking with us. Joining me now is Kourosh Shamlou, the attorney at law, Middle East and international relations expert. Ms. Shamlou, thank you for being on the program. We're talking about what's happening in Vienna. There have been some optimistic signals from the Iranian side, what Arakchi told the Iranian media. There's also some optimistic sort of signaling by the U.S. National Security Advisor, Jack Sullivan. However, the E3 are saying we have much work and little time left. Against that background, we would have hoped for more progress this week. So they do not seem to be very optimistic. What is your sense of what's happening?
My thoughts are that the Iranians and the Americans, both of them know that they need to reach an agreement and reach an agreement very fast, because there will be an Iranian presidential election sometime soon in June. and the conservative may get back to power. And they need, that's what Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, said. And the Iranian, the Supreme Guide said Iran needs to reach an agreement with the Americans, because Iran needs its economy to boost again. So they need that relief, that sanction relief from the Americans. And the Americans know if they don't reach an agreement with the Iranians, Iran will go straight forward to the nuclear bomb, because they started enriching uranium to 60%. And if the Americans don't get a deal with the Iranians, at some point they will have to go to war in order to stop Iran, or to send Israeli to bomb a nuclear site or kill nuclear scientists, which would not change anything, because Iran has the capacity, the knowledge to get the atomic bomb, the nuclear bomb.
Okay, so you're saying that while the Iranians obviously need sanctions relief, it's hurting the economy a lot. There are going to be the presidential elections also, and something needs to be done before that. And on the American side, of course, the Americans don't want the Iranians to actually make a nuclear bomb. You're also saying that the Iranians do have the capacity to make one. Now, the Israeli assessment is that Iran is not close to making one in a time span of a few months, but it would take them a year, year and a half, or maybe 2 years. Now, in the meantime, the Israelis have been doing everything to sabotage the program and set it back. There's also an Iranian delegation in Washington, D.C. The chief of Mossad spoke with the American president. What do you think they were discussing? Was Joe Biden telling the Israelis to not sabotage the deal, or were the Israelis telling Joe Biden that, you need to play a stronger hand because we have the tools to set the Iranian program back?
Yes, exactly. As you said, that you have an Israeli team over there in the United States. They actually discussing this negotiation with the Israeli and at the Israeli embassy in Washington. And as you said, the Israelis sabotaged the Natanz nuclear site recently, and Iran responded by enriching more uranium. Israel wants to put pressure on the United States and the Europeans, saying that this deal is not good. You should not sign any deal with Iran because it's not good for Israel. But on the other side, we don't understand why Israel is so scared, because Israel is a nuclear power. It has a lot of nuclear bomb, and it is scared of a country that still doesn't have. And as you said, Iran is 1 year or 2 years far from to getting this bomb. Israelis are sending Joe Biden messages that if he goes to that agreement, they will continue to sabotage Iranian program nuclear. They will keep on killing scientists. And the Americans on the other side are giving the Israeli a lot of guarantees, saying that they will try to control Iran, and they will send the military aid, of course, to the Israeli, and the military equipment to Israel. And Israel is taking advantage of this situation because they know that the Americans at the end will sign a deal with Iran. So on the other side, they want to get a lot of things, a lot of advantages from the United States. And they will get it.
Okay. So much. That was Kourosh Shamlou speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the continuing ravages of a mutated COVID-19 virus in India. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Earlier today, India reported more than 300,000 new coronavirus cases for a 12th straight day, taking its overall caseload to just shy of 20 million, while deaths from COVID-19 rose to 3,417. But what's more worrisome is that medical experts say The real numbers across the country may be 5 to 10 times higher than the official tally. At least 11 states and union territories have imposed some form of restrictions to try and stem infections. But Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government is reluctant to impose a national lockdown, concerned about the economic impact. The government is also facing rising criticism from several quarters, with critics accusing it of callousness and sheer incompetence. According to a Reuters report, a forum of scientific advisors set up by the government had warned it early March of a new and more contagious variant of the coronavirus taking hold in India. Leaders of 13 opposition parties on Sunday signed a letter urging Modi to immediately launch a free national vaccination and to prioritize oxygen supply to hospitals and health centers. To discuss this further, I'm joined by Dr. Anant Bhan, a medical doctor with expertise in global health, health policy, and bioethics, and Ashok Wankhade, a journalist whose career spans 38 years of reporting and editing responsibilities. Let me begin with Dr. Bhan here. Anant Bhan, we discussed this a couple of weeks ago. Where do you think the situation? We know that it's getting worse, but in terms of the support system, are we at a stage where you think things will begin to shape up better in the coming days?
Just thanks for having me. The situation still is pretty serious and dire. As you were describing in your introduction, there is now data from the last week by itself which shows that India had almost 26 lakh cases, which is 2600,000, and almost 23,800 deaths just in that 1 week. And unfortunately, the numbers continue to rise. This issue is now not just of concern for urban India. We are now getting data also from rural India in many parts of states like Uttar Pradesh, Haryana, Madhya Pradesh, etc., that this is also impacting rural India quite adversely. And unfortunately, as we know, in South Asia, rural healthcare can be very weak as compared to what is available in urban settings. The positive news comes from some parts of India, especially Mumbai, where I think there's been some plateauing. All thanks to, I think, really smart management at the local level. They've set up ward level control rooms. They've been keeping a tab on the oxygen supply. They've been trying to identify patients early and provide care to them. And the municipal officers have taken a lead in that. So I think that's making a difference. There is some evidence of a little bit of a gradual fall in the sort of acute rise that we were seeing in some other parts of India, but I think it's too early to tell. The challenge, I think, remains that will these short-term measures in a limited part of India of lockdowns have an impact and at least help decrease the slope, because as you know, if the number of cases keep rising and already we are having a challenge with the health system, it's going to be increasingly difficult to be able to cope with that number of cases. So I think now is the time to innovate more step-down facilities where early management can be done, and so that the only very, very serious cases which require tertiary care are referred to facilities with ICUs and ventilators. We do need to de-stress the health system as soon as possible.
Okay. Now, leaving the politics of this aside, and unfortunately, these situations do get politicized. As I said, there's a lot of criticism of Modi's government, and the opposition will exploit that. But let me ask you, a bit of the technical side also, in terms of a second wave, the virus getting smarter, mutating, the double mutation that we talk about. Is that the reason for these infections and the exponential sort of growth of these? Is it because of the religious and political congregations that surely were irresponsible, as many critics say they were? Or it's a combination of the virus getting smarter and people getting complacent?
Just it is a combination. Multiple factors have fueled the rise in the wave that we have seen. I think part of it is that we were clearly not prepared enough. This is something perhaps policymakers in the government circles had really not predicted. They were not at any point of time expecting it to go so bad. So that shows that we were probably not, learning from the experiences of many other countries where there have been subsequent, sometimes larger and sometimes much more faster spread kind waves. We could have had an early inkling on issues such as, the rise of some of these variants by doing better quality surveillance, especially genomic surveillance. The variants and the mutations obviously have a role to play. I mean, some of these variants can be more infectious, some of them can escape testing, etc., and might not be picked up. But the real facilitators are, is human contact of the kind that if you don't have adequate masking and distancing and hygiene measures put in, then you're going to catalyze that spread. And that unfortunately has been the case through large gatherings, political, religious, also social, a lot of marriages and other social functions happening without adequate precautions. And unfortunately, I think by the time steps were taken to try to mitigate that, the spread had been quite diffuse and was also aggressive enough that we are now seeing the downstream implications of that. So again, I think lots of learning from this. One would have thought that based on the experience globally and in India from last year, we would have been better prepared. Clearly not the case, but a learning again for India in how it needs to do better on this, but also all our neighbors in South Asia, because we share a lot of these characteristics and they are equally susceptible to some of these situations.
Absolutely. Final question, Anant Bhan. Among many damning reports, frankly, one was this Reuters report. As I said in my opening, the Forum of Scientific Advisors, and there were like 4 of these people. I mean, this was a government body. I mean, the government set up this body. 4 of these scientists have come on record saying that by early March, they had warned the government that this is coming. So if that is correct, then it's quite damning. Then that means that the government did not take this seriously, whether in relation to the Kumbh Mela, whether in relation to all the rallies in West Bengal, elections elsewhere. So it seems to me that to that extent, the criticism of the Modi government is on the dot.
So my opinion is quite clear on this, which is that, a pandemic is a public health crisis, and the response to public health crisis has to be driven by opinion of those who are trained in epidemiology, in public health, who can use the right modeling experiments and estimates, as well as look at the data coming in from the ground and then make inferences around what to expect and how to plan for that. If those advice points are not heeded, if we don't have adequate data to be able to inform these individuals who are involved in those decisions, then you will have poor policy planning. So I think again, if we had looked at the data closely enough, if we had transparent data available, and this was analyzed properly, it was likely that we would have had an we would have obviously had an earlier warning on the possibility of this rise, and also acted much more quickly to try to reduce the spread of the infection and the severity of its spread.
Couldn't agree with you. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Anant Bhan speaking with us. Let me pull in Ashok Wankhade here. Mr. Wankhade, what is your sense of, where would you apportion blame or pin responsibility for this disaster that we have been witnessing in India for the last 2 weeks?
Basically, the government of India is responsible. The mismanagement at the government level is totally responsible for this mess. Because when the rallies were being organized, when the Kumbh Mela was organized, when the relaxation was given to a great extent after the first wave, almost many people, many scientists, many doctors did warn, many organizations did warn. The second version of the second wave coming up in Europe and other developed countries were giving a lot of indications. And then the first time when the double muted virus was found in one of the rural district of Maharashtra, one of the prominent states in the country. That was nearing February. But after that also, the government took it very lightly. The system was giving warning. I think perhaps the government there was some political compulsions of Kumbh because it is the Hindu-dominated area, state and country, and the Hindus have a bigger festival. The Prime Minister came in for that demand. Then the 5 state elections, I don't know what made government to go ahead with the elections, and the elections they proved to be so fatal that now the people coming from Kumbh, they are proved to be a big spreader. And all of a sudden, the double muted has another quality. It is airborne. So the spread is very quick, very fast, and they hardly give you time for a treatment. It's a hardly 4 days treatment. So the casualties were high. The demand of oxygen all of a sudden increased compared to the first wave. Once the demand for oxygen increases, then automatically the oxygen feeders and the oxygen carriers and then the demand for the ventilators, everything increases. And the quantum was so high. I do agree, no country in the world will have the total beds available, the 10% of the population, they can't make a bed available because nobody thought of. Now, government is taking things very seriously after a lot of court intervention. The Supreme Courts, the various high courts, they have intervened so heavily on the government. So the government has been compelled to run around. Now government is taking a lot of new initiatives. Like we have got a lot of many aids coming from 40 countries, the oxygen, the cylinders, the cryogenic tankers, the ventilators, everything is coming up. Now we are creating the adequate hospital facilities. The beds are being provided. The temporary hospitals have been erected by the army and defense forces and the social organization. At the same time, if third wave comes, we will be shortage of the human resource. The Prime Minister has immediately identified the areas where the action has to be taken. All the nurses, near about 2.5 lakh nurses have completed their training and education. They are waiting for exams. So before exam, they will be pressed into the services. There are more than 1 lakh doctors waiting for the exam for the post-graduation. They have been asked to immediately place in the services. So the government is trying, but basically certain mistakes the government made. Those mistakes have the nation is paying very heavily for that. That is the fact. We cannot deny. And for all our neighbors, all entire countries in the Asia, as what Dr. Saab has said, that we have the same character. So whatever India has made a blunder, at least our neighbors, they should make sure that they don't do it. But before winding up, I would also like to wish all my friends and my fraternity in Pakistan, as we are celebrating the International Press Freedom Day today. So all my friends in journalism in Pakistan, I wish them all the best for that. And it is a crusader. The media has played an important role in bringing all these things on the front. It was the reporting of the media which made the courts aware that what exactly is happening. So media played an important role. So same thing I also expect from this thing. Now government is taking seriously, but the damage has been done, no doubt about it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mr. Ashok Wankhade. Thank you also for your greetings and good wishes for journalists in Pakistan. I really appreciate this. That was Ashok Wankhade speaking with us. This is all from In Focus this evening. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. And as I always say, and as you've just heard, what's happening in India, given the third COVID-19 wave in Pakistan, stay safe and follow the non-vaccine safety protocols. Good night and goodbye.